We've been working all year on them, so you want to do that. We're in Romans chapter 1. Starting a series called Finding Your Fire for God. You know, in Revelation, Jesus was talking to the church and said, you have lost your first love, or you have lost your fire for God would be another way to say that. We need that fire. Scripture says he is a consuming fire. And we need to get back to those days when we just couldn't hear enough about Jesus, couldn't read his word enough, couldn't tell enough people about him. So we're going to be going through the book of Romans, and today we're talking about the life of faith. And we're looking at this series. Paul wrote this while he was in the town of Corinth. He hadn't been to Rome, but he's writing to the Romans. There was a church in Rome, and the church is ascribed to Paul starting it, but he had never been there. So the mystery of how that could be, and what the scholars believe, is that there were people that traveled, like we have people that travel today. They went out to some of the different lands, and they heard Paul speak, or they heard about Paul. Through Paul's teaching in other churches, they heard about Jesus Christ. They became believers. They went back home, and they started telling others. They started gathering together. They formed a church. Paul had heard about that, and he said, I want to come to you. I want to get there. And Paul did get there one day. You know how? By being a prisoner. That's how he got there. The Roman government transported him there as a prisoner. But he did get to go, and he did get to preach to Jesus Christ. That was about 55 or 56 AD. And Paul starts out, he jumps into the deep water. Paul was a deep person. He was highly educated, highly trained, and he had something about his life that maybe some of us have too, is he was very highly educated and very zealous for what he believed in. But then one day he found out he was absolutely wrong. When Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, and a voice came and said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you? He said, I'm the Lord Christ whom you persecute. And Paul became a believer and became a tremendous leader in our Christian world. The first chapter in Romans, he's addressing to the Gentiles. Let's start at verse 10 and read along. Romans 1:10. In my prayers and at all times I pray that now at last by God's will the way may be opened for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. See, that's those numbers I'm talking about. When you come to church, you encourage all of us because you join in to worship with us, and it helps all of us have a greater faith. Verse 13, I don't want you to be unaware, brethren. I've planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. I am obligated both to Greeks and to non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. Then here's his famous verse. I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godliness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Powerful words there about God's righteousness. And he talks about that righteousness from God. And he's countering that with the Mosaic law, because the law was designed, if someone could keep it perfectly, to make them a righteous person who then would have access to the presence of God. But of course, no man could. No man can be perfectly righteous. So we needed another righteousness. And that righteousness came from God through Jesus Christ. He who knew no sin became sin for us. And through his redeeming act, his atoning act on our behalf, his substitutionary death on the cross for us, we now can have righteousness that we could never obtain before. The depth of God's mercy is tremendous, because in being estranged from God through the sin that was in our lives, we were forever doomed to be apart from God. We were forever doomed to spend that time in the lake of fire and brimstone. And a lot of people, that's unpopular to talk about. But where you'll hear it talked about the most is in Jesus Christ. He didn't steer away from it, about the cost and the perils of hell. So God in his mercy did not let us follow the course of nature, did not let us get what we justly deserved. He intervened through his Son, Jesus Christ, and became that righteousness on our behalf. We need a great foundation. Every edifice, every building has to have a great foundation. The foundation must be deep enough. It must be substantial enough to support the weight that will rest upon it. Sue and I had the opportunity to tour England some years back, and we visited Salisbury Cathedral. And it's an interesting story. The bishop of the area at that time wanted a huge, huge steeple on top of the church, a big cross. Trouble is, it was too heavy for the church that was built. And you can go into the sanctuary, and it's got massive columns, I guess they must be this big around, made up of granite or marble beams about 8 inches around. And you can put your head against those beams and look, and those marble, 8-inch marble post columns are bent. You can see the bend in them from the weight of the steeple. And they've been working to build up the foundation. You must have a good foundation, and that's part of the prayer warrior thing I'm talking about. The same is true of our faith. We need a sure foundation for the challenges that lie ahead, for the things God calls us to. It must be deep, and we must be fully embedded in it. And to look back at Romans 1:20, read that again. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, we can see the trees, we can see all the creation, but there are invisible qualities that he made done. Those are his eternal power. God had no beginning. He has no end. He has no one superior to him. He is the ultimate. He is the all-powerful. His eternal power is part of our foundation. His divine nature. God is divine. God and divine are synonyms for each other. He's separate. He's above everything. He is that divine one. Those attributes have been clearly seen by from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Paul's writing this in 55 AD. People didn't have TV. They didn't have the internet. Most of them didn't have books. Scrolls were even limited to the rich and wealthy. But God made himself known. That's part of his justness, because he doesn't hold people guilty to what they don't know. So God revealed himself to the people so that they would know there is a God, there is a creator, there is one mighty that they needed to worship. And because of that, because God did that, he can say, you're without excuse. I made myself known to you. Our faith is built upon that foundational knowledge that there is a creator. We call him God. Our God is eternal. No beginning, no end. Our God is powerful. Powerful enough to speak the universe into existence. I know Carl Sagan doesn't believe that, but I do. We recognize him as God because he is God. He supersedes definition. We know this because God has revealed it to us. When we look at the vastness of our universe, or when we look at the minute details of our world, it all points to a powerful creator who is above all. And in fact, the proof from God is so clear and undeniable. That's why he says we're without excuse. This spring, we studied the constellations. We studied the gospel and the stars. And many people poo-poo it as not being valid. But as we studied, we could see God's hand in those stars. We have that sure foundation in a mighty God. When we have that faith in him, we have fruit for our faith. 17 says, for in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Genesis tells us Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Again, kind of like I talked about in the announcement, some things don't change. God says, I, the Lord, do not change. And this is one of them. That righteousness comes by faith. Even though Christ hadn't died yet for Abraham's sin, because he trusted God when God said do something, God credited it to him as righteousness. And then later, of course, Jesus died for Abraham's sins. Faith in God results in an understanding of our lack of righteousness. The more we see him, the more we should tremble before him. The more we see how great and gracious he is, the more we should say like Isaiah, woe is me, for I am undone. On the contrary, when we create God according to our image, what we think God should be, then we bring him down and we make him accessible and we don't cower before him. But that's an idol. God is above us. This seeing him, this righteousness leads us to a faith in him. That faith is a fruit. That faith is a fruit in the lives of others. So there's fruit in the faith. And then there's fortitude in our faith. This verse of Paul, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. You see, he was mocked. He was jeered at. He was argued with. People didn't just believe him, but what he said, everybody. There were people that sought to kill him, just like they did Jesus. But Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. I'm afraid we are. The gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. That's where it was more important for Paul to take the abuse for what he believed in so that maybe the person listening would come to know Jesus Christ. Because that gospel produces faith in others, produces righteousness in others, produces a path to heaven in the others' lives. And Paul was willing to make that sacrifice for them. The knowledge that the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ, gives strength to our faith. It's not something we made up. It's not our creation. It's not some famous theologian we follow from 100 years ago. This Bible, God had it written through 40 different authors over the course of hundreds of years, and it blends together seamlessly with the story, with his story, with the gospel in the stars, I believe, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. We witness the power of God in the lives that are changed. We see that in our life, or I hope we do. We see it in the lives of others. In the movie, I Can Only Imagine, the movie about the song, how it came about. The man who wrote that song is given testimony at the end. He's telling Amy Grant, my dad was a monster. And some of the things they showed in the movie, he was a monster. He got mad at his son because the son didn't want breakfast, and the son was a grown teenager. So his dad took the plate and whacked it against his head, breaking the plate. He would do things like that. The boy said, my dad was a monster. His wife left him, couldn't live with him. He said, but I saw God change that man, my dad, into someone I wanted to be like. That's powerful when we see that, when we see somebody's life changed. Hadn't seen the movie? See it. If you have seen it, watch it again. God works that way through the foundation of faith, through the gospel. Thus we have that sure foundation, and we have that faith that results in a positive effect, fruit in others' lives and in our own. And this sure foundation and evidence builds a strength in our faith that cannot be shaken. Talking about faith, thinking about that we are God's highest order of creation. I believe we are a higher order of creation than the angels. God imbued us with some things that the angels don't have. And we have an opportunity that the angels don't have, and the Bible tells us they long to look into it. We're a high order of creation. We're marvelous, multifaceted individuals. We have the ability for great intellect. We have the capacity to retain from our experiences, to grow from that. The retention is used to teach us, and by that teaching we grow in knowledge, and this knowledge should be used. Being a person of faith doesn't mean you check your brains at the door. It doesn't mean you blindly follow God. You follow God because you've seen all the things we've talked about, the fruit. Something we need to also remember is we are a supernatural, eternal creation. We're not just bones and flesh. We have the spark of eternality in us. So much of our education system today, so much of Charles Darwin and those people that follow him, and Carl Sagan and others, try to tell us that we're just a happenstance of amino acids that got excited by some lightning that over the course of millions and billions of years managed to make a bigger cell, and then that cell divided and that eventually became who we are. That takes a lot of faith. But the trouble in believing that, if you believe that you are only amino acids that eventually turned into a high thinking animal is you are in the end just an animal. And as an animal, it doesn't matter what you do. You might as well commit sin. You might as well be bad to others, because when it's over, it's over. You might as well do what you want if you're just an animal. But if you are a creation of Almighty God, with that spark of eternity in you, you have a higher calling. And we all have an accountability we're going to come to. We are a supernatural, eternal creation. God did that when He breathed into Adam. That imbued Adam not just with breath, but with the essence of God. And that makes us eternal. It makes us supernatural. You may not think of yourself as a supernatural person, but you are. He made us an eternal creation that is not natural, it's supernatural. This eternal, supernatural existence has been passed down to us generation by generation, from Adam to you and me. Faith can seem to counter knowledge. And indeed, there is a conflict between faith and knowledge sometimes. How do we resolve that conflict? How do we exercise who we are intellectually with our supernatural creation and faith? We resolve the conflict by putting the correct emphasis on the correct syllable. I had a music professor once that taught me when we're singing to not put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. It's important that we emphasize the right thing. So it is in our life. Faith tells us what, when, and where God would have us engaged. God is the one who says what to do, where to do it. But our knowledge gives that path to accomplishing what God wants done. So God issues a call. He says, Wes, Sue, Mark, this is what you are to do. And then we use the abilities, the talents, the attributes to accomplish what He has given us. That's how we mesh faith and knowledge. We look to faith to God for the vision of what's to be accomplished. And then we use the creation of God to accomplish His will as He infills us, as He helps us. We've talked about faith and knowledge, or knowledge I'm going to start calling facts. Knowledge is facts. But where do feelings come into play? We know we have feelings. We're a people of deep feelings or emotions. God is a God of deep feeling and emotion. You read His Word, you find He gets angry, He gets heartbroken. Jesus, when He heard Lazarus has died, wept. Emotions, feelings are very much a part of God and us. Faith alone can lead us to be aloof to those around us. We can take a haughty spirit. Well, if they had faith, they wouldn't feel this way. Facts or knowledge can make us harsh towards others. Well, if they hadn't been so stupid, they wouldn't be in that problem. That's what knowledge can do. Feelings help us to have empathy for others. Feelings help us have sympathy for others. We feel their pain. We can connect with them on an emotional level. And in that, we have an opportunity. So feelings are important. Feelings help us to not be apathetic, uncaring, where others are concerned. But the caution is feelings must never be the driving motivator of our behavior, because of the three, faith, fact, and feeling. Feelings are the most prone to error and misperception. We know that our feelings change. We're almost on a whim. So I've got some slides I want to show you to do that. Those are the three we have, faith, fact, and feeling. They make us up. Feeling, remember that Debbie Boone song, You Light Up My Life? You light up my life. There's a phrase in there that's terribly stupid and wrong. The phrase is, it can't be wrong if it feels so right. That's heresy. That's a lie straight from the pit of hell. Feelings can't give us truth. And so that's song anyway. So we don't want to let feelings drive us and be more important than faith or fact. Then I was thinking about Dragnet. You all know Dragnet? Joe Webb. Joe Friday was Joe Webb was the actor. Harry Morgan. Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am. He didn't want to hear anything. Just the facts, ma'am. So we can be driven by facts. We can be driven by knowledge. But that can make us arrogant. Paul says, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. You ever known a fool that thought he was wise? 1 Corinthians 8:1, we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. So we need to be careful. Knowledge is important. We need knowledge. Knowledge helps us, but it needs to be in the right order. Then there's faith. There's God's view. Hebrews 11:6, for without faith it is impossible to please God. For anyone that comes to him must believe that he exists. He doesn't prove it. You got to believe it. And that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And if you think about it, that believing that he exists is that one time of salvation where you came in your life and you realized there was a God, there was a Jesus, and you needed to acknowledge him in your life. That is believing that he exists. Believing that he is a rewarder of those who seek him helps us to continue our life in the faith, doing what God calls us to do. We believe that he is going to bless us for obeying him. So that's those verses, and that's God's criteria. And so we come to the right order of things, where faith is the main driving factor in our lives. We live by faith. We listen to God say what, and we follow in it. But then we rely on facts. It's smart to rely on facts, to get our information right, but we can't let the facts supplant the faith. Because a lot of things God says to do don't make sense. A lot of things God says to do seem foolish. We're going to look at Hosea. Hosea was a preacher called by God, and God said, go marry a prostitute. That's foolish, right? Why would God have a prophet, a preacher, marry a prostitute? But God used that. We're going to study that. And then finally, feeling. Feelings are part of us. Feelings help us connect to others, and we have an emotional response in worship to God. But again, feelings are the worst motivation for serving God, for living with him. And so this is where we are in our walk of faith. This is what Paul is leading us to. Bible wisdom is seeing things through God's eyes. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't appropriate that, if you don't use it properly, you might as well be a fool. You can know all things, but if you don't have faith in God, if you don't see it through God's eyes, you're missing the boat. And so these are the things. Wisdom includes facts and feelings, but it's driven by faith. To move forward in God's kingdom, we must add faith to our facts and feelings, and we let faith rule our hearts. And so as we have this initiative, for some of you, everything inside may be saying, that's not going to work. It's not going to happen. We've done it before. Some of the famous last words of a dying church. We've never done it that way before, or we've done it before. Either one's bad. God has established a system. God says he will reward that system to the faithful. God's people telling those who don't know God about Jesus Christ. That's the plan. It's always been the plan, and it's the plan now. And so we're doing this, and we're calling you to be a part of it. Something else I wanted to mention in my announcements, but I forget her, he was working good. Someone said to me, we've done that. That's where some of those comments came from. And I've already addressed that, yes, that was God's plan. But let me share something else with you. When the church was doing that, where were you 4 or 5 years ago? You had 100 or so in church, didn't you? You had a bunch of youth. You had a bunch of children. Had mission trips. So it proves the point. When we're reaching people for Christ, God's house is full and the ministries are overrunning. And so, yes, did that before and it worked. We can do it again, telling people about a Savior that'll give them hope, that'll help them not be lonely, that'll see them through the storms of life. And as we do that, God will bless, and we will have the joy of seeing lives saved for Christ, seeing the baptismal waters stirred by obeying God, living a life of faith.